Hello, fellow readers and booktubers. This book is The Complete Stories of Flannery O'Connor. This was published in 1971, just 7 years after her death. It was a winner of the National Book Award in 1972. By that time, though, O'Connor had won a number of awards and a lot of recognition for being a great writer. She died in 1964 at the age of 39, very young, from complications from lupus, and she had a urinary tumor and some other complications there. So she had a short life, but during her short life, she did write 2 novels, Wise Blood and The Violent Bear It Away, but also 31 short stories, and that's what's in here, all 31 short stories. And it's the short story form that she's best known for, and that's what won her a place in the pantheon of great American writers. And she's still there in that pantheon, and I think she'll always be remembered for that. She's from the South. She lived in Georgia most of her life, although early on, as her talent began to blossom, she did spend some time in Iowa at the Writers' Workshop there, and then in New York City, where she wrote Wise Blood, and then for a short time she was the guest of Robert Fitzgerald and his wife in Connecticut. Robert Fitzgerald, by the way, is the famous translator of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I think he translated some of Sophocles and Euripides' work. Chances are, if you have a copy of the Iliad or the Odyssey in your house, if it's an older edition, it's the Robert Fitzgerald translation. But anyway, it was her Southern roots that really informed these stories and providing them with a sense of place. And we're talking the Deep South here, that Southern attitude. Most of the characters in this story have that way of looking at the world, which includes deep systemic racism and then some very obvious, literal racism, and a belief in the myth of the Old South. This idea that prior to the Civil War, the South was a land of high culture and sophistication and morality and tradition, good God-fearing people. As far as their slaves were concerned, there was either a belief in the racist belief in the hierarchy of races. The lighter your skin, the more superior you were. That would be coupled with the other idea that the Southerners or the South was bringing civilization to the black Africans, so by way of slavery. So slavery was a good thing. This was this kind of antebellum Southern thing. These attitudes still exist in parts of the South today, unfortunately. It's interesting, though, when O'Connor was writing these stories, it was in the 1950s and into the early 60s, just before she died. And it was at a time when the civil rights movement was really gaining some traction. And these ideas of the high culture of the Old South, these ideas were under fire and being challenged, roundly rejected, sometimes even violently, and so she's right at a time when all that stuff is exploding. It's under attack. And she was very, very much aware of this. Although she has been accused of being a racist herself because of her free use of the N-word in many of these stories. But, these stories are set in the Deep South, and that word is only used in dialogue when white people are talking to each other, or within the context of the thoughts of her characters. So it's not O'Connor herself using that word to describe black Americans. It's the characters in the story who are all Southerners. Okay, and so it gives these stories an historical reality. If these characters weren't talking like that, it would seem strange. I mean, it can be quite jarring to see the N-word used, but you remember this is the Deep South, and this is how people talked. In fact, some people still talk that way, unfortunately. Alice Walker, the Pulitzer Prize winner, the woman who wrote The Color Purple, she herself was a person of color, and she wrote an essay where she addressed this charge that O'Connor was a racist. It's the essay titled "A South Without Myths." I'm going to quote Alice Walker here. "O'Connor's stories are not about race at all, which is why it is so refreshing, coming as it does out of such a racial culture. If it can be said to be about anything, she means Flannery O'Connor stories. If they're about anything, it's about prophets and prophecy, about revelation, about the impact of supernatural grace on human beings who don't have a chance of spiritual growth without it. It's very powerful, and I think Walker is quite correct in this. And in fact, she was noting something deeper about Flannery O'Connor stories, and that these stories really, more than anything else, they deal with the spiritual dimension of human existence. O'Connor is often described as a Southern Gothic writer. She was described that way in her own time as she was writing these stories. I think today when a lot of people hear that term Gothic, it's associated with horror stories about ghosts and vampires and things like that. These stories are horror stories, but it's not a supernatural kind of horror. It's the real horror of the most human kind. These are stories about people who do horrible things or who cling to horrible thoughts and ideas. It's not like the Stephen King kind of horror story. Stephen King he's a literalist. When he talks about zombies, he really means zombies. When he talks about ghosts, he really means ghosts and demons and all this. For O'Connor, none of that stuff is in these stories. But that sense of dread, that existential dread, is always lurking around the edges of these stories, sometimes right between the lines. It's always there. So these really are horror stories made more horrible because they take place in the real world, not in some kind of fantasy world with ghosts and goblins and things like that. But what makes people monsters? Well, what O'Connor touches upon again and again is that it is the thing that makes monsters or potential monsters of everybody is quite simply sin. O'Connor would go so far as to say original sin. Now, this is a concept that's certainly outdated for a lot of people. It's misunderstood, even perhaps unknown to another generation. But O'Connor absolutely believes in the idea of sin. Instead of being called a Southern Gothic writer, O'Connor herself said she described herself as a, quote, Christian realist. Some of her stories they deal with racism and immigration, but there's always this Christian morality in there, or specifically a Catholic morality. It's about salvation, it's about the sacraments, it's about spiritual awakening. Those are the themes of these stories. Like her parents, O'Connor was a devout Catholic all her life. She attended daily mass, went to confession regularly, and she always stated that Catholicism was the thing that shaped her worldview and her writing. And in Catholicism, there's this belief that God is at work in the world and he moves in mysterious ways. That's almost a cliche. God works in mysterious ways. However, let me be very quick to add, these are not stories about these are not pious stories. These aren't stories about saints. They're not stories about angels showing up to save the day. These aren't stories about miracles or people welcoming Jesus into their lives and then they live happily ever after. That's not what these stories are. These stories are dark and they're incredibly disturbing. The stories, there's just a deeper understanding of what it would mean to be a Christian or to embrace Christianity. It's about a faith that the world often rejects or the world doesn't understand or even recognize. O'Connor wrote a letter to a friend of hers back in 1962 where she was comparing her Catholicism to Protestantism. Now, for those of you not familiar with these terms, once upon a time, for nearly 1,000 years, if you lived in Western Europe and you were a Christian, you would have been a Catholic. Okay? The Protestant Reformation changed all that. So, Catholics and Protestants are Christians, but the way this works is if you're a Christian but you're not a Catholic, you're a Protestant. In fact, the word Protestant means to protest, and what was being protested was the authority claimed by the Catholic Church. So Protestants are Baptists and they're Congregationalists and they're Anabaptists and they're Methodists and they're Lutherans and they're evangelicals and all that. So So anyway, in this letter that O'Connor wrote to a friend, she's comparing her Catholicism to Protestantism. Now, this was written in 1962, okay? And I'm quoting O'Connor here. One of the effects of modern liberal Protestantism has been gradually to turn religion into poetry and therapy, and to make truth vaguer and vaguer and more relative, to banish intellectual distinctions, to depend on feeling rather than thought, and gradually to come to a belief that God has no power, that he cannot communicate with us, cannot reveal himself to us, indeed has not done so, and that religion is our own sweet invention. Of course, I am a Catholic, and I believe the opposite of this. Her Catholic faith told her that there is a God, and God does communicate directly with us. He does reveal himself, and he does it through the gift of grace. But grace can be lost, it can be denied, it can be rejected, and in her stories, that's what often happens. That's what drives these stories. Father Damien Farrar, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly, he's an O'Connor scholar. He's written a couple of books analyzing the stories of Flannery O'Connor and her life and all this. He wrote, O'Connor herself said that every one of her stories contains a moment when grace is offered to a fallen character, although it is usually rejected. The popular Catholic bishop, Robert Barron, talking about O'Connor's story, says, grace always breaks through in the stories, usually in some kind of painful way. In fact, one of the complaints that's often leveled against the O'Connor stories is the extreme violence. And it's always unexpected. It just seems to come out of nowhere. And it's horrifying. But that's what's driving this. People rejecting this gift from on high, but rejecting it without even realizing it. Again, these are not stories about piety. There's no miracles in these stories. There's just harsh, grim reality. So the two pillars of O'Connor's writings are, the Southern Gothic kind of writing, dark, existential dread, all that kind of stuff, and her Roman Catholic beliefs. There are some other motifs that kind of show up, I noticed as I was reading these stories. A number of them have a common kind of context. The story will involve a young person who moved to the big city, usually New York City, with the hopes of becoming a writer, and things don't go well. And so then they have to move back home with their parents, but their father has died, so they have to move back with their widowed mother, and that's in the Deep South. So you've got the main character who's lived in the big city, they've gotten a great education, they're very sophisticated. Now they have to move back to the Deep South with all of its ignorance and racism and all the rest, and how they have to make adjustments for that. And that creates a tension that drives a number of these stories. It's kind of interesting. The character is a young writer who doesn't quite make it. You think that maybe Flannery O'Connor might be talking about herself, although it's not always a female. Sometimes it's a male character, but nonetheless, there's something she's touching on there. Another thing that comes across in many of these stories is that there'll be a character who represents or is symbolic of that old South thing that I mentioned earlier, the antebellum South. They're hanging on to a past that's long gone, dead and buried, and they're refusing to surrender to the changing times. And by the end of the story, they end up paying for their stubbornness. And sometimes they'll experience incredibly violent acts against themselves, as if O'Connor is acting out a kind of revenge fantasy against these people that are still clinging to these horrible racist ideas. She's going to crush them, and in the stories they get beaten up or brutalized in some way. It's especially interesting, these characters representing the Old South. In a number of the stories, they've convinced themselves that they're really good people, and that the Old South was a good thing, and represented a superior culture, and they're bemoaning its loss, but they believe themselves to be good people. And in one of the stories, one of these unfortunate characters is being beaten to the ground and being told, as kind of like a refrain to the story, you're not who you think you are. In other words, you think you're a good person, but you're not. That's quite a powerful thing. Another thing about this particular collection, the stories are presented in the order that they were published. So the first couple of stories in here, this is O'Connor as a young writer. Her talent is already on display. But those earlier stories are a little more unnecessarily complex, I think. A little unfocused, but as you start moving through the collection, her writing becomes sharper and clearer and even more horrifying as you go along. I'm certainly not going to go through all 31 stories in here, but a couple of the standouts. The big standout in this one is the story called A Good Man is Hard to Find. I think that's the story that really made her reputation. It shows up in a lot of short story collections. A term I've heard a lot lately when people are discussing horror stories or movies, they'll say, oh, that movie is nightmare fuel. Well, this particular short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, is nightmare fuel. But again, there's no monsters in it, there's no zombies, nothing like that. But there is a character in here who's referred to as the misfit. He's a human being, but it's very dark, it's very troubling. And in that story, the dread, the fear slowly grows. It's building, and eventually it explodes in the last couple of paragraphs in a really tragic way. Another story in here that was a standout for me was, the title of it was Displaced Person. This one was kind of interesting. It deals with immigration, but these are immigrants who are coming from Europe. Now these stories, remember, most of them were written in the 1950s, and there are a lot of Europeans coming over to the United States, escaping the ravages of World War II. And so in this one, there's this immigrant family coming. They get a job in the South. All these stories are set in the South, working on the farm, and the woman who is hired them doesn't like them. She doesn't trust the immigrant and all of this, and so it's a story about fear, ignorance of the other, and very timely, I think. But at one point in the story, the woman, there's a priest in the story trying to convince this woman to be kinder to these immigrants, and it is stated that Christ was just another displaced person. In other words, Jesus was an immigrant too. Don't forget that. But again, this story, because of the ignorance, just overwhelms the woman, and again, with tragic results. Two other stories, The Comfort of Home and The Lame Shall Enter First. Those two stories share a common theme, another theme here, where you'll have like a stable home or a stable environment, and then it's invaded by a disruptive force, usually a person. Although the invader is welcomed in, seen as a troubled person who can be helped. But what begins as a charitable act has unintended consequences, which are horrific. And you really see that in The Comfort of Home. And then The Lame Shall Enter First. It's very powerful. The Lame Shall Enter First, that's the story that comes closest to being kind of like a Stephen King story. There's a hint of the supernatural in there, but not quite. But again, it's, a stable home, a person with the best of intentions invites somebody else into the home who does not have good intentions, and who is, does a horrible thing. To get into deeper depth with these stories, I know I'm kind of being a bit vague about this. I don't want to give away any spoilers. I'm warning you, though, these stories often end with horrific, sudden, disturbing events. But I don't want to give anything away. But in The Lame Shall Enter First, and in The Comfort of Home, it seems to me that what O'Connor is trying to describe here or reveal is that the evil is real. And if it's not recognized for what it is, it's going to turn on you, which is a pretty dark view. One other story here that I enjoyed a great deal is called Parker's Back. This one is the only one that provides something in the way of comic relief, although in some ways irony kind of is in a lot of these stories. There is kind of a humor there, but Parker's Back in particular provides some kind of laugh out loud humor, some genuinely funny moments. Parker, the main character, is almost a slapstick figure, but the closing moments of that story, nothing tragic or horrible really happens, but something very bittersweet occurs. And Parker, his entire life, he's been avoiding responsibility for his actions and all of this, and you realize he's avoiding the possibility of love in his life, and then finally love forces its way into his life. This love descends upon him, and he can't escape it, and he just doesn't know what to do about it, and he breaks down in tears. Very powerful stuff. All these are powerful stories. So that's Flannery O'Connor, The Complete Stories. I strongly recommend it. She's a great writer, and if you've never read her, I think you should give yourself the opportunity. Although I'm warning you, these stories can get pretty dark, but not gratuitously so. That's all I've got for you today. Keep reading and stay strong.